Okay, so we saw how to query the results. Now, how to display the results. And that's basically where we'll put in the the list adapter in place, just like our recycler view adapter. So you can get um, the uh, get the query results by creating columns of the from the cursor that you want to look at. Okay, so here you have um, a word list columns which has word and the locale ID. ID is not required here. I mean, you don't want to display the ID, right? Because the ID is an internal mechanism. Then you have a word list items, which is an array of the dictionary word and the local and such information that would go on on the UI, part of the UI. So these are the fields that you would populate. Then you create a cursor adapter. Yeah, so this was uh, basically a list of view IDs um, on which you would put the data. And then create a cursor adapter, which can take a form of a simple cursor adapter, an inbuilt class. You give it the context, and then set the layout, a word list row. This is just like our recycler view. A word list row here would be, say, an item in your journal app, a journal entry item in the journal app. And then you feed it the cursor because that has all the data. You tell it which columns to retrieve, um, and you give it an array of integer IDs to put on the layout. And then any additional flags, usually none of them are needed, um, but you can specify to filter or modify the display of the data further. And then you simply set the adapter using the cursor adapter. So this line is exactly like what we saw in the recycler view back then. Um, so this is the example for simply getting and displaying the data. You can do similar things for um, insert, update, and delete as well, the other members of the CRUD gang. Okay. All right. So this was the client part. Now, uh, what about creating a content provider? Suppose you are building that dictionary app or the camera app, and then you want to provide a way for other apps to access your files, your data. Okay. So first of all, consider if you really need content provider. The first point I mentioned in the beginning was you would build content providers only if you want to let other apps access your data. It's not meant for accessing data within the app. You have other mechanisms, internal storage and databases that we have already seen. But if you want to offer complex data to other applications, that's when you should do it. If you want to allow users to copy that data from your app to another app, that's an example of using content providers. Or if you want to provide custom search suggestions using the inbuilt search framework, or expose your data to the widgets, widgets that show up on, say, lock screen, for example, weather data or recent photos, something like that. And um, details that we won't go into, but if you want to implement a cursor adapter, cursor loader, etc., that's when you can use content provider. I mean, you can create content provider. Okay, some steps in it. First, design the raw storage. That is when you decide whether it's a file data or a database data, that is a structured data, and you decide how to expose that, how to actually handle that raw storage. So file data is an example where you want to share or make available your photos, audios, videos, etc., or other documents, of course, PDF files, for example. These will be stored in your application's private space. The internal storage, you have looked at it in one of the homeworks, and they offer a so your content provider will basically offer a handle to the file. That's what it will do, and then the client app can read from that file or copy data from that file. With the structured data, that is databases, etc., um, you would store the data in a form that is compatible with the row column tables, and row will represent entities like person, item, etc., and column will represent the attributes like person's name, etc. And then you'll expose this data as well to the client. Now, implementing the content provider. So content provider is basically an abstract class, and you will implement these methods which have same signature in the identically named content resolver classes. So you'll implement these methods which are supposed to do whatever they say. So let's quickly go over that. Okay. Query, as it says, retrieves the data and returns the data as a cursor object. Insert will insert a row and return the content URI for the newly inserted row itself. Update will update the existing rows and return the number of rows that were updated. Similarly, delete will delete rows and return the number of rows that were deleted. Get type returns the MIME type as a string. It can be null if there is no MIME type associated, and then you can deal with that particular MIME type. Um, on create, so since this is a component like activities and services, it has a lifecycle method, and on create must be implemented to initialize your content provider. Except for on create, all these methods can be called from multiple threads. So um, um, these should be these methods should be able to deal with threading and synchronization. So on create is called immediately after it creates the provider, and the provider is not created until a content resolver object actually tries to access it. So it's not created when you install the app. It's created when someone is trying to access your app. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so this point about all these methods should be thread safe, except on create, because they can be called from multiple threads. Um, Other best practices, so avoid doing any lengthy operations in on create, which is applicable to other components as well. Um, in this case, more specifically, defer any initialization tasks until they are actually needed. So, you may want to load your entire file to be passed, etc., but don't do it till it's actually needed and actually those calls are being made. Um, um, and the third point is, although you must implement these methods, the code does not have to do anything except return the expected data type. So you may, for example, you have to implement, insert, delete, etc., but you may not want other apps to insert, delete stuff into your database. So in that case, just have an empty method, return whatever the appropriate data type, 0 for the number of rows deleted, for example, and that's it. You don't have to do anything else. These can be stub methods, dummy methods for that purposes. Okay, there are a few more steps. One of them is implementing permissions. So by default, the idea is data files stored in the internal storage are private to your application and to your provider. Similarly, databases you create are private to your application and provider. Now the question is, how do you expose these to the other apps? If you simply make them all public, then anyone can read write. That is unrestricted access, which you don't want. By the way, the files on the external storage are public and world readable. Even if you prevent it, users can go to them through some other API like external storage API. So, but yeah, to restrict the access appropriately, you define the permission in the provider and then ask the client apps to use those permissions. There are several details here, but I'll leave the details to the online reading to online guide. You can take a look at it there when needed. Okay, finally, you should implement the provider element. You should include the provider element just like your activities and services, etc., um, and specify the authority, the class name, permissions, and a few other things in the manifest file. Without those, the content provider basically won't kick in. Okay. All right. So that's all about the content provider, a very high level introduction. Um, and you can use it in your applications um, if you want to let other apps access your data, as we said. Okay. Thank you.